scary things, miners unknowingly entered a death trap. It's gonna be scary, guys. Hopefully not too scary. We'll see.
On May 10th, 1897, 35 miners started down the 1,000-foot ladder to the depths of the Snaefell mine. Many of these men would never see the light of day again. This is their horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is advised.
Ooh. Viewer discretion is advised. Viewer discretion is advised, guys. This is not for children.
At 6 o'clock on the morning of May 10th, 1897, 35 miners working the Snaefell mine assembled outside, ready to begin the early shift. The spring air was crisp, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky, indicating a beautiful day ahead. It was a shame the miners would miss it, but the village of Laxey on the Isle of Man had an economy built by mining, and the miners had families to support. For those unfamiliar, the Isle of Man is a small island in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Great Britain, but despite its size, the mines there were loaded with valuable metals.
I was gonna ask, where is this located? It's the Isles of Man.
Mining in an area known as Snaefell Mountain began in 1856, and by 1897, the mine had more than 10 levels branching off its 1,026-foot or 313-meter main shaft.
Sometimes I don't think about mines being like mines, you know what I mean? Like, I play video games with mines, and I don't think I grasp that mines actually exist, that people would dig big holes into the ground to mine for things, and like people died in the holes.
Traditionally, the mining industry used a unit of measure called a fathom. A fathom is 6 feet, so the Snaefell mine was 171 fathoms deep.
Ooh.
It was one of the smaller mines there, employing just 50 men, but it produced more than enough
That was a small mine?
ore to impact the worldwide metal industry. After a briefing by mine captain John Cooley, the men entered the mine and began descending the ladder to their assigned levels. Snaefell mine had just one way in and one way out, and that was the main shaft. It was essentially a large rectangle divided into 3 compartments, one for the ladder, one for buckets called kibbles, and the last for the compressed air pipes that ran the boring drills. Each level also had a platform, and each platform had a hole in the floor smaller than the opening of a front-loading washing machine for the ladder and the men to pass through. Interestingly, unlike other mines, Snaefell was warmer inside than outside, and since warmer air is less dense and easier to move than cold air, the mine had a natural ventilation system. So the current of fresh outside air actually circulated down the main shaft to each of the levels.
That's convenient. Also, that is a small hole. That is claustrophobic.
Most of these tunnels were fortified with thick wooden supports to prevent collapse, and the tunnel width ranged from 8 feet or 2.5 meters all the way down to just 40 inches or 102 centimeters. As was typical, John remained up at the top with the winch operator to better supervise the day's ore yield as the last of the men went down the ladder. He was just settling in when a handful of the miners then reappeared and lunged out of the shaft, gasping for breath and completely exhausted. One of the men then told John that everything was fine until they got to the 60-fathom level, where they all started to feel intensely drowsy and weak. As John listened, a few more of the men crawled their way out of the main shaft, and these men were much more lethargic than the others, and some passed out the moment they reached safety. Knowing something was terribly wrong, John yelled an order to several of the less affected men to send help from the Laxey mine a few miles away. As soon as the order was clear, John started down the ladder and immediately encountered some of the others around level 60 who were having an even harder time climbing out. No one at that level was even conscious any longer. Each was breathing, but John knew they wouldn't be for much longer if he didn't get them out soon. By the time he got down there, some of the first miners out of the shaft recovered enough to meet back up with him. Almost immediately, all of them started to feel these same symptoms that initially drove them out, but they weren't going to leave anyone behind. They had to try to save as many as they could. Outside the mine, within 2 hours of sending for help, 40 volunteers from the Laxey mine arrived and immediately started assisting the others. When they finally had the manpower on site, several volunteers helped attach a large tube-shaped vessel to the end of a winch that was simply called the box. This vessel was
That's eerie, the box.
Just slim enough to fit down the shaft and just big enough to fit one man inside it. So by 5 o'clock, the box had lifted 3 of the incapacitated miners out. But this was just 3 of so many that were still down somewhere in the lower sections.
Oh no.
Even worse, the constant climbing up and down mixed with whatever was affecting them in the deeper reaches of the shaft took a massive toll on the rescue
Quickly, everybody get into the box.
effort. At 65 years old, John put himself in serious danger as he took 10 round trips just to get as many of his men to safety as he could. As all of this was happening, news was rapidly spreading through the towns in the surrounding area. One doctor from Laxey came up the mountain as soon as he heard the news. Meanwhile, in the capital city of Douglas, the High Bailiff also heard about the crisis and got in contact with G.J. Williams, Britain's assistant mine inspector. Williams just happened to be on the island performing a series of routine inspections, and upon
That's lucky that he happened to be there, honestly.
hearing the news, immediately rushed to the Snæfell mine. At 6 p.m., he arrived and gathered John, the doctor, and the Laxey mine captain to regroup the rescue effort. Then, leading a party of miners on site who had been able to rest for an hour, Williams descended to 74 fathoms.
Okay, what do you guys think happened? You think somebody farted really badly and it wiped everybody out? Like, it was just such a bad smelling fart, like sewage smelling level of fart that just got all the miners down there just like, dying.
From there, he and one of the volunteers from the Laxey mine continued down the ladder, planning to observe what they could at the 100-fathom level. Before they even reached that point, however, there were 3 bodies blocking the way to the platform, each of them dead and each of them still draped over the ladder.
Oh
They
my
had
God.
clearly passed away trying to save themselves. With this blockage, the rescue party had no choice but to return to the 74 level and report the conditions further down. But when they started to ascend the ladder, they finally noticed how weak and tired they were. Each of the rungs felt like they were a mile apart, and climbing was incredibly difficult. Finally, when they even barely reached level 74, they found that everyone else was gone. Williams and his partner then continued to climb until they reached the 60 level, where they found John and the others resting. This group also had to ascend because while waiting at 74, they had all started to feel unusually sleepy and weak. By level 60 though, no one could climb any further. They were all on the
Oh my God, what is getting them? It must have been a really bad fart.
verge of unconsciousness, and if they couldn't get to the top, they were as good as dead. Thankfully, Williams had one last trick up his sleeve. When the High Bailiff contacted him about the crisis and filled him in on what was happening at Snæfell, Williams immediately knew what was likely causing the men to grow extremely tired and weak before they died suddenly. On his way to the mine, he stopped at a store, ran inside, and bought a small bag of some sort of white powdery substance. After paying for it, Williams stuffed it into his pocket and resumed his race to the mine. At the 60 level, with the rescue party fading fast, Williams gathered up some loose newspapers, crumpled them up, and placed them together on the
He got cocaine.
platform floor. Then he pulled out some matches, struck one, and placed it on the pile of newspapers. When the fire took, Williams pulled the bag from his pocket, reached in, and pulled out small handfuls of the powder. With his fist over the fire, he carefully started sprinkling it on the flames, which made the fire all the more intense. He then instructed everyone to put their faces into the smoke coming off the newspapers and breathe it in. After a few deep inhales, incredibly, the rescue party started to feel a little stronger and had just enough energy to finish the climb out. The substance William had is something called potassium chlorate.
Oh.
When it burns, it doesn't emit noxious smoke like wood fires. Instead, potassium chlorate produces oxygen when it's burned. After being rejuvenated by the oxygen, the
I didn't know that. The more you know. Oh, I didn't know you could burn and create oxygen fumes. What? What? Ooh. My burrito bowl. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
rescue party managed to recover 3 bodies on higher levels on that trip, but no one else they came across was alive. After their own experience inside the mine, Williams, John, and the mine captain were positive that anyone who hadn't come out of the mine since the early morning wouldn't be leaving it alive. The rescue effort came to an end later that night, leaving the group to discuss what to do next. They knew that whatever was affecting them was much more intense deeper down. They also noticed
But what was causing them to the lack of oxygen? Chemistry is like magic, honestly.
a subtle sweet smell of burning wood further down, but there was no visible smoke to indicate a fire. Either way though, they knew something had filled the lower reaches of the mine with a lethal concentration of carbon monoxide gas.
It was CO2, yes, but what put the CO2 in there?
With the remaining miners presumed dead and high levels of carbon monoxide where their bodies were located, it would have been safest to wait until the mine was clear to begin the recovery effort. John and Williams knew, however, that the heat in the mine would accelerate the decomposition of the bodies, so the decision was made to begin recovery first thing the next morning. At dawn, miners and even more volunteers showed up to lend their assistance. The effort that day resulted in the recovery of 10 bodies, but during this, one of the volunteers from another mine in the area was so overcome by gas at one point that he passed out and needed to be transported to the top in the box. By May 12th, another 5 bodies had been recovered, and the recovery effort had reached the 115 level, but there was still one miner's body that hadn't been located. Unfortunately, after everything else was thoroughly checked, that meant the only place it could be was further down.
Oh Oh no.
The problem was that the air at 115 was still so
Maybe it got really cold down there all of a sudden, and so they didn't vent up properly. You're right.
heavily saturated with carbon monoxide. It would only get much worse as they descended. Before they continued, Williams wanted to know exactly how much they were inhaling, so he had bottles sent down from the top that were filled with water. When he got them to the 115 platform, he tied a rope around himself and descended the ladder to get closer to the next level, which was 130. He then uncorked the bottle and dumped it, and as the last drops fell, the poisonous air rushed in and filled the bottle.
Oh.
These samples could then be brought up and tested, but by the time Williams and the others reached 115, he had already been inside the mine for hours.
Oh no.
While working on the third bottle, Williams suddenly lost consciousness and went limp on the rope.
I think that's why the carbon dioxide was only at the bottom layers and it didn't go up. But I don't know. I don't know much about carbon dioxide except that if you inhale too much of it, you die.
Somehow, the men holding the rope managed to pull him back up to 115, but when he got there, he was still unconscious. So next, one of the men punctured the compressed air line that ran down the shaft. He then pulled Williams toward the pipe and placed his mouth right up to the hole, which had fresh air inside. Williams would regain consciousness, but he was still so weak that he had to be removed from the mine in the box.
Oh no.
When he was finally safe and in the care of the doctor, one of the other mine captains went down to where he had lost consciousness and managed to locate the last miner. The body was maybe just 10 feet below him, but just like Williams, before he could reach it, the captain passed out and needed to be rescued as well. Later that day, Britain's chief inspector of mines, Sir Clement Lenev Foster, had finally arrived in Laxey after a long journey from England. He had been keeping tabs on the situation through wireless telegraph and telegram messages, but he was finally able to get a more in-depth briefing when he was on site. Clement brought a fresh set of eyes and ideas, and since the urgency of the crisis has faded with the last man confirmed to be dead, Clement saw no reason to begin a renewed recovery effort until the next day. The next morning, Clement arrived at the mine, and his first order as the new recovery effort leader was to end the human testing of conditions inside the mine. No one would be allowed down until he tests the air. He then told the men to remove the box.
That makes sense. Don't put people down there unless you need to, right? And they're gonna put rats?
In the winch and attach the regular bucket. He then set candles and a lantern in the bucket, then lit the wicks. Inside a small cage, Clement also placed a mouse and attached the cage to the winch hook. Then, foot by foot, the bucket was lowered into the mine. If there was a lack of oxygen anywhere, the candle would go out and the mouse would be dead upon return to the top. Then, looking down the shaft, Clement watched the bucket until the candle started to go out. Based on the amount of rope used, this occurred around the 115 level. The mouse, however, was still alive when the bucket returned to the top. Clement then took the captains and Williams down to 115 to repeat the test, and this time, after leaving it at 130 for a few minutes, the mouse was dead. Clement then went on to repeat these tests over the next few days and was stumped by the results. He expected the air quality to improve at 130 over time, but there was only marginal progress. As part of his brief on arrival, Clement was told that all the ventilation doors in the main shaft were shut, but with suspicion, he asked again. John assured him they were closed, but Clement knew he had to be mistaken. Sure enough, Clement found 2 ventilation doors wide open on level 100. Then, when the air still hadn't gotten any better, even after closing those, he knew there had to be more that were open. You see, these ventilation doors controlled the flow in and out of the mine's many branching levels. When all the ventilation doors were closed, the flow of air went straight down the main shaft to the deeper reaches of the mine without entering any of the offshoots. If any of these were open, the flow would be reduced as the current was split into
That makes sense.
Several streams. Open enough doors above, and the air at deeper levels went almost completely still. Incredibly, this wasn't some new development at the mine. This was a well-documented problem, and the miners often complained of bad air the further away from the main shaft they got. However, working with all the doors shut wasn't an option. Work could be done in every tunnel on any given day. This ventilation system was apparently so bad that the owners couldn't keep the mine open when July and August rolled around. The hot summer air would blow into the naturally warm mine and make conditions completely unbearable everywhere and almost to the point of suffocation more than 100 fathoms down. Unfortunately, neither the parent company nor management really seemed to care about the miners' complaints though. Just in the days leading up to the ordeal, there were 2 opportunities to prevent the tragedy. The first was on May 5th when the mine was inspected by the mine captain. In his report, he found the mine to be in satisfactory condition. 2 days later, it was examined again and the report was filed mentioning nothing about ventilation problems. On the contrary, it contained
What? Why are they not talking about the ventilation?
remarks that the ventilation system was effective and working perfectly. This second report was written by, of all people, Williams. Efforts to retrieve the last miner went on every day, and just like every other, the carbon monoxide levels were too high. Some of the miners pleaded for permission to just go and get him, but Clement refused. The idea of grabbing the body with a grappling hook was also attempted, but quickly abandoned when the hook disturbed the air below them enough to send carbon monoxide upwards, forcing them to flee. It wouldn't be all the way until June 7th, almost a full month since the ordeal began, when the miner's body was finally recovered. It was that of 21-year-old Robert Kelly.
No.
In the aftermath, it was determined that the ventilation system, as bad as it was, wasn't the direct cause of the tragedy, but it did make things worse. How much worse wasn't revealed until Clement's investigation was completed and an official report was released. In it were the concentration results of the air samples taken from the mine. The safe zone for carbon monoxide concentrations in the air we breathe every day is 0 to 6 parts per million. In that range, humans can breathe the air for an average of 24 hours a day with no ill effects. Jump up to 9 or 10 parts per million, and that average goes down to just 8 hours.
Whoa.
Between 25 and 35 parts per million, it drops to 1 hour, and by 100 parts per million, it's safe for just 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
That's where carbon monoxide concentrations reach the severe category, and at 800 parts per million, humans can die within an hour of exposure. The air deep down in Snaefell Mine's main shaft had carbon monoxide concentrations of 10,700 parts per million. That's 13 times greater than the concentration that can cause death in 1 hour.
That's crazy amounts.
Giving the men 1 to 3 minutes from the moment of exposure to save themselves. The ascent from the 130 level took the fittest of miners no less than half an hour. This meant that those at 100 fathoms or below simply had no chance. Once they start to feel symptoms, it was already too late. In Clement's inspection of the mine as well, he determined that a fire on levels 130 and 141 was to blame. The fire was about as far away from the main shaft as anyone could be inside Snaefell Mine, and
There was a fire, guys. That's why.
that distance may have contributed to the tragedy. The area where the fire was located didn't get much fresh air circulation, even if all the doors were shut. Any fire that far down would likely smolder instead of rage due to the environment. There was just enough oxygen to keep it going, but not enough to allow it to overtake the mine. In addition, the shift on May 10th started just after dawn. On any other day, the morning shift picks up where the shift the night before left off, but the mine was closed on Sundays. When the Saturday night shift ended, none of the miners reported anything out of the ordinary, so the fire had to begin between Saturday night and Monday morning.
Oh, no.
Considering the carbon monoxide levels, Clement theorized it all started closer to Saturday night. The previous week, some of the miners were in the tunnel on the 130 level installing timber supports. Since mines didn't have electricity, miners used candles and lanterns to light their way in the tunnels.
Makes sense.
Many would put a chunk of clay on their helmets, then in the clay they'd stick a candle, making a primitive headlamp. Miners had to keep an eye on their candles during a shift, because if the wicks burned out, the men would be in complete darkness, and that brought the work to a stop, so they'd change them during the down moments. They did this even if the lit candles still had plenty of wick left. The safety procedure for this scenario was simple. All they had to do was ensure that there was no smoke coming from the wick before setting it aside. Men would often watch the candle until the smoke stopped or lick their fingers and use them to pinch the wick. However, either through carelessness, forgetfulness, or laziness, this didn't always happen. Clement believed a miner left a candle burning near a timber pile.
Guys, don't mess with fire. Don't mess with fire. The lesson is don't mess with fire.
On 130, and after the shift ended, he never blew it out. Then, for the rest of the weekend, the fire smoldered and smoke filled the bottom levels with colorless, odorless carbon monoxide. When the miners showed up to work on Monday morning, the lower levels were completely saturated and the gas had worked its way up to around level 40. Since the gas was also weaker near the top of the shaft and gradually got more concentrated the deeper the miners went, by the time many of them noticed symptoms, it was already too late. In the end, 20 men between the ages of 21 and 46 were killed in the tragedy. 19 on May 10th, and a survivor in bad shape passed away in the hospital a few days after being
That's so sad.
rescued. These men left behind 14 wives and 30 children. If you made it this far,
Wow.
thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
They didn't have to mention the 30 children, but those 30 children are dead now too.